the first time the Duke of Thornwood publicly humiliated his wife. The candlelight in the grand dining room seemed to flicker with pity. Livia stood near the doorway, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached, watching her husband smile at another woman. Lady Caroline Ashby, golden-haired and laughing, rested her gloved fingers on his sleeve as if she had every right. The Duke, Alexander Thornwood, inclined his head toward her and murmured something that made Caroline's laughter ring like silver bells. He had not spoken a single word to his wife since she entered the room. Guests turned their gazes toward Livia. She felt their stares like needles pressed into her skin. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. No one came to her side. No one offered her a glass of wine or a place at the long, candle-lit table. She was the Duchess of Thornwood, yet she was more invisible than the shadows rippling across the silk wallpaper. Finally, the Dowager Lady Matilda Thornwood, Alexander's stern aunt, sniffed and said loudly enough for all to hear, "I suppose some bloodlines simply do not know how to behave in proper company." A cruel titter rippled through the room. Livia's face burned, but she forced her lips into a gentle smile, curtsied, and retreated to a chair in the corner where she sat alone for the entire dinner. That night, lying in her cold bed, she pressed her palm against her chest and whispered to the darkness, "He will never love me. Perhaps I should stop hopping." 3 months earlier, Livia Ashworth had stood at the altar of the village church, her heart fluttering with a secret, tender hope. She had seen the Duke of Thornwood only once before the marriage contract was signed, at a spring fair when she was 17. He had ridden past on a black horse, his dark hair windswept, his expression stern, his eyes the color of winter storms. She had loved him from that moment, foolishly, silently, the way a girl loves a story she knows is too grand for her. But her father, Baron Ashworth, dying and desperate to secure an alliance to protect their small lands from a grasping cousin, had used an old promise between their families. The Thornwood and Ashworth houses had once been close. A marriage had been arranged decades ago, never fulfilled. Alexander's father had owed Livia's father a debt of honor. On his deathbed, the Baron called in that debt. Alexander, now Duke, had come to honor the obligation with a face of stone. He looked at Livia as if she were a piece of unwanted furniture. There was no courtship, no gentle words, only a cold contract signed in a dusty study. On their wedding day, Livia wore her mother's ivory silk gown, trembling with nerves and fragile hope. She imagined that once they were bound, he might soften. But when the priest pronounced them man and wife, Alexander lifted her veil with a brisk motion, placed a kiss so light on her cheek it could have been a breeze, and turned away to greet the guests. That was the first time she felt the sting of his indifference. At Thornwood Hall, a vast gray stone manor of endless corridors and whispering servants, she was given a suite of rooms far from his. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crewe, a pinched woman who had served the family for 30 years, showed her around with an air of condescension. "His Grace prefers his solitude, my lady. He is not to be disturbed." Livia nodded meekly, swallowing the lump in her throat. She tried. Every morning for the first month she arranged fresh flowers in his study. He never commented. She asked the cook to prepare his favorite roast pheasant. He ate in silence, often with a ledger propped open. She suggested a stroll through the gardens. He replied that he had estate business. She lingered in the hallway, hopping to catch his eye. He passed her as if she were a ghost. One afternoon she gathered the courage to ask if she might assist with the estate accounts, as her father had taught her to manage books. Alexander barely looked up. "That will not be necessary. I have a steward." The dismissal was as final as a slammed door. Livia walked back to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and let the tears fall silently. Then came the dinner party, where Caroline Ashby appeared like a jewel in the darkness. Caroline's father was a viscount, an old friend of the Thornwood family, and it was an open secret that before the marriage, Alexander had intended to make Caroline his duchess. Livia heard the servants whispering in the corridor the next morning. "Lady Caroline was his true love. This one is just a duty. Poor thing." The words burrowed into her heart and nested there. After that humiliating night, Livia's hope began to wither. She still dressed carefully each day, still performed the duties of a duchess, but the light behind her eyes dimmed. She stopped arranging flowers. She stopped waiting for him in the hall. She accepted that her marriage would be a hollow shell, a polite fiction she must endure. 1 week later, while sorting through her late father's belongings in a trunk she had brought from home, Livia found a letter he had written to her in his frail hand. It read, "My dearest Livia, you are braver than you know. Do not let a cold world freeze the warmth in your heart. Seek purpose and you will find your own strength. Love may come late, but it will come if you are true to yourself." She pressed the letter to her chest and wept. That night she made a decision. She would stop begging for a love that was not offered. Instead, she would become someone worthy of respect, even if that respect was only ever her own. The change began quietly. Livia explored the estate beyond the manor walls. She discovered that the tenant farms on the western ridge were struggling after a blight had ruined the previous harvest. The families there were thin and hollow-eyed, their children listless. The Duke's steward, an aging man named Mr. Phelps, told her that the estate funds for repairs and seed had been diverted to other projects by the Duke's late father's debts. The tenants would face starvation come winter. Livia listened, and a plan formed. She had brought a modest inheritance from her mother, carefully saved over the years, not a fortune but enough to buy seed, tools, and a healer's supplies. She could give it secretly. She asked Mr. Phelps to keep her involvement confidential. "The Duke need not be burdened with small matters," she said softly. Phelps, a loyal man who pitied the young Duchess, agreed. So Livia became an invisible benefactress. She rode out in simple clothes, her hair pinned under a woolen cap, and visited each farm. She paid for new plows, for winter rye, for a midwife for a pregnant tenant. She sat with sick children, pressing cool cloths to their foreheads while their mothers wept with gratitude. She sold 2 of her mother's silver brooches to buy medicine when a fever swept through the cottages. The tenants began to speak of a mysterious angel, but few knew it was the Duchess herself. She did not want recognition. She wanted to fill the emptiness inside her with purpose. Months slipped by like pages in a forgotten book. Livia grew stronger. Her cheeks gained color from the fresh air, her hands became capable, her smile more genuine, but not for the Duke. She barely saw him. She rose before dawn and returned at dusk. She dined in her rooms, no longer waiting for an invitation that never came. The distance between them stretched into a chasm, and she made no move to bridge it. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alexander Thornwood stood at the window of his study, staring out at the drive. He had not seen his wife in 3 days. He frowned. It was not that he missed her, he told himself that, but her absence unsettled the rhythm of the house. He had grown accustomed to the faint scent of lavender that lingered after her, to the soft rustle of her skirts in the corridor. Now the hallways felt barren, the silence somehow louder. He summoned Mrs. Crewe. "Where is her Grace?" The housekeeper hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with her apron. "Out on the estate, Your Grace. She spends most days visiting the tenant farms." "The tenants, whatever for?" "I could not say precisely, sir, but she is well regarded among them, very well regarded." That was a surprise. Livia, the quiet mouse he had married, well regarded. He had paid her so little attention that he could not imagine her commanding anyone's respect. He dismissed the housekeeper and felt a prick of irritation. Why did he care? He should not. And yet the question lingered like a splinter beneath his skin. That evening, a local squire hosted a harvest supper. Livia attended at Alexander's side because protocol demanded it, but they walked in like 2 strangers sharing a carriage. She wore a gown of deep forest green that made her auburn hair glow in the candlelight, and Alexander found his gaze drifting to the curve of her neck, the quiet grace in her posture. She was not the pale, trembling girl he remembered from the wedding. There was a steady poise to her now, a calm that felt almost like armor. At the supper, a young gentleman named Mr. Henry Pemberton, the newly appointed assistant steward, approached Livia with a warm, open smile. "Your Grace, the tenants on the West Ridge speak of your kindness as if you were a saint. I am honored to finally meet you in person." Livia's face lit with a genuine smile, one Alexander had never seen directed at him. She spoke animatedly about crop rotation and the new schoolroom she wanted to establish for tenant children. Henry listened with rapt attention, his admiration obvious and entirely unguarded. Alexander stood rigid by the fireplace, a glass of port forgotten in his hand. He watched his wife laugh at something Henry said, and a hot, unfamiliar sensation twisted in his chest. It was sharp and possessive, and it took him a long moment to recognize it for what it was: jealousy. He set down his glass and crossed the room, placing his hand firmly on Livia's elbow. "My dear, the carriage is ready. We should depart." Livia stiffened at his touch. She looked up at his face, her expression unreadable, and nodded. "Of course." She bid Henry a gentle farewell, her voice soft as a caress, and Alexander practically steered her out of the hall. In the carriage, the silence was thick enough to choke on. Livia stared out the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Alexander wanted to speak, but all the words felt clumsy and wrong. Finally, he said, "You seem familiar with that man." "Mr. Pemberton has been helpful with the estate accounts," she replied coolly, not turning her head. "He is a good man." "Good men can be dangerous," Alexander muttered, and immediately regretted it. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. Livia turned to look at him then, her eyes carrying a flicker of hurt and something deeper: disappointment. "Do you think so little of me, Your Grace, that you would insult my character?" Her voice trembled only slightly, but she held his gaze with a quiet strength that made him feel small. He had no answer. The rest of the ride passed in crushing quiet, and when they reached Thornwood Hall, she retired to her rooms without another word. The following days brought a cold formality that unsettled Alexander more than he cared to admit. Livia was never rude, never angry. She was simply absent, present in body but withdrawn in spirit. She answered his rare questions with polite monosyllables. She no longer lingered in any room he entered. It was as if she had drawn a veil between them, and he had no idea how to part it. A few days later, Caroline Ashby arrived for an unexpected visit. She breezed into the morning room where Livia was writing letters, her silk skirts rustling with the confidence of a woman who believed she still belonged. "My dear Duchess, I hope I am not intruding. Alexander and I have so much history. I simply cannot stay away from Thornwood. It feels like my true home." Livia set down her quill and folded her hands. "You are welcome, Lady Caroline. Shall I send for tea?" Caroline sat uninvited, her bright eyes scanning the room with a proprietary air. "You have made a few changes, I see. The draperies are much less severe. Alexander always preferred the heavy velvet his mother chose, but I suppose you would not know that." The barb struck, but Livia's newfound composure held. "I am learning what he likes." "Are you?" Caroline leaned closer, her voice dropping to a silken, conspiratorial whisper. "Did you know that he once wrote me a letter swearing he would never marry another? He promised to find a way to break the contract with your family. I still have that letter." She smiled sweetly, her eyes glittering with malice. "It is my most treasured keepsake." The room seemed to tilt. Livia's heart lurched painfully, but she forced her expression to remain placid. "Then I am sorry he could not keep that promise." Caroline looked momentarily thrown by the lack of tears or fury. She recovered with a tinkling laugh. "Oh, you are a cool one. But do not worry, your marriage is a matter of honor and duty. We all understand what that means." After Caroline swept out, Livia sat motionless. So he had loved another. He had tried to escape the marriage. That explained everything: the coldness, the distance, the way he never looked at her. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it quickly. She would not cry any more for something she could not change. That evening, she wrote a quiet letter to her late mother's solicitor, inquiring about a small cottage in the north that had been part of her mother's dowry, a place to retreat to if necessary. The hope of love was fully extinguished now. She would focus only on her work, on the tenants, on building a life that required nothing from him. Alexander, meanwhile, found himself in a state of constant, restless irritation. He could not concentrate on his ledgers. He kept glancing toward the window, listening for the sound of her footsteps. Twice he went to her sitting room, hoping to find her, but the room was always empty. He asked the servants about her activities, and they spoke of her with a warmth he found baffling and troubling. She sat with old Tom until he passed peaceful, one maid said, her eyes glistening. She paid for the Miller boy's medicine out of her own pocket, the cook added, shaking her head in wonder. Then his Aunt Matilda cornered him in the library one afternoon. She was a formidable woman with iron-gray hair and a gaze that missed nothing. "Alexander, sit down," she commanded. "I have watched you stride about this house like a bear with a thorn in its paw, and I have held my tongue long enough. You are a fool." He bristled, "And I do not." "That girl," Matilda continued, ignoring him, "has been quietly saving this estate from ruin while you have been sulking over a lost romance. The tenants worship her. I looked at the estate books, Alexander. The anonymous donations for the Western farms, for the new seed, for the schoolroom. They match exactly the sums drawn from her private inheritance. She has given nearly everything she possessed, down to selling her mother's silver. And you have given her nothing but neglect and cold silence." The truth hit him like a physical blow. He sank into a chair, his mind reeling. She had spent her own inheritance. She had sold her mother's treasured pieces, and he had not even noticed. Guilt, sharp and merciless, carved a hollow in his chest. He thought of her simple gowns, her lack of jewelry, the way she never asked for anything. He had assumed she was merely plain in her tastes. He had been so terribly, arrogantly wrong. He sought her out that very evening. He found her in the small, warm parlor off the kitchen, a room he rarely entered. Her hair was escaping its pins, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek from working in the garden. She was reading to a tiny tenant girl who had been frightened by the recent storm, her voice soft and soothing, the child curled trustingly in her lap. The firelight painted them both in gold. The scene was so tender, so full of a warmth he had never allowed himself to feel, that Alexander could not speak. He stood in the doorway, invisible once more, but this time the invisibility was his punishment. When the child was collected by her grateful mother, Livia noticed him. Her expression shuddered like a window closing. "Your Grace, is something required?" "Livia," he said her name without formality for the first time, and it came out like a plea. "I have discovered what you have done for the estate. The tenants, the farms, all of it from your own funds. Why did you not tell me?" She rose slowly, brushing off her skirt. "Would it have mattered? You have made it clear that my presence here is merely a duty to be endured. I did what I could to be useful. I did not seek your gratitude." "You should have sought it," he said hoarsely, stepping closer. "I have been blind and cold and unjust. I believed you had forced this marriage, that your father had trapped me into it." Livia looked at him with a sad, knowing smile that broke something inside him. "I know what you believed. I have known from the start, but I never forced anything. I came to you with hope, Alexander, real, foolish hope, and you crushed it day after day. I thought perhaps if I were good enough, if I served this house and its people, you might one day see me as something more than a burden. But I see now that you never will." "Livia, that is not true." "Please," she held up a hand and her voice was barely a whisper. "I am not asking for your pity. I have found my own peace. I ask only that you let me continue my work without interference." She stepped past him and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. He stood frozen, her words ringing in his ears. She had loved him once. She had hoped, and he had killed that hope with his coldness. The weight of his regret nearly buckled his knees. The following week brought a fierce, unrelenting storm that flooded the lower tenant cottages. Livia, disregarding her own safety, rode out with blankets and supplies, her hooded cloak soaked through within moments. Henry Pemberton and several men from the village were already there, rescuing families from the rising water. Alexander, hearing from a frantic groom that the Duchess had ridden into the storm, felt a terror unlike any he had ever known. It seized his heart and squeezed. He saddled his horse and galloped through the driving rain, his mind filled with a single desperate thought. I cannot lose her. Not now. Not ever. He found her in a partially collapsed cottage, holding a crying infant while the mother was being helped to safety. Her face was pale, streaked with rain and mud, but she was utterly calm, issuing quiet instructions. "Get them to higher ground," she told Henry. Then she looked up and saw Alexander, soaked and wild-eyed, his chest heaving. She blinked in genuine surprise. "You came," she said, the words nearly lost in the wind. "I will always come," he said, his voice breaking. He dismounted and waded through the swirling water to her side. "Please, Livia, come away from here. I cannot bear it if anything happens to you." She handed the infant carefully to Henry and let Alexander guide her out of the ruined cottage. Once they were under the relative shelter of a stone barn, they stood shivering, the storm drumming overhead. He shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She looked up at him, searching his face with wary eyes. "Why are you doing this? Why do you suddenly care?" "Because I am a fool who cannot bear to see you in danger," he said, his voice raw and honest. "Because I have realized that the cold arrangement I resented has become the only warmth I crave. And because I learned something today, something that changes everything." He took a ragged breath. "Caroline told me, in a fit of spite, that she possessed a letter I wrote years ago. A letter I sent to your father refusing the marriage. I swore in it that my heart belonged to another and begged to be released. I thought your father received it and forced the union anyway. But Caroline's father intercepted that letter. It was never delivered. Your father never knew. You never knew." Livia stared at him, her lips parting in shock. "You tried to refuse me." "Yes, I was a proud, stubborn young man who thought he loved unwisely. And when I believed your family had ignored my plea, I let my bitterness poison everything. I blamed you for a betrayal that never happened." He reached for her hand and she did not pull away. "You came into this marriage innocent, bearing hope, and I destroyed it with my coldness. I am so sorry, Livia. So deeply sorry." Tears spilled down her cheeks, mingling with the raindrops that still clung to her lashes. "All this time I thought you hated me because I was not her, that I could never measure up." "You exceeded everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was too blind to see the treasure I had been given. You gave your fortune, your compassion, your strength, and I gave only silence. I am not worthy of your forgiveness, but I am asking for it. I am asking for a chance to learn to love you as you deserve to be loved." She was quiet for a long moment, the storm slowly abating outside. Then she said, her voice steady despite the tears, "I never stopped loving you, Alexander. Even when I tried with all my might to stop. It was always there, buried under the hurt. I do not know how to trust you again quickly, but I am willing to try." A sob escaped him, raw and unguarded. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass and sunlight. "Thank you," he whispered into her wet hair. "Thank you. I will spend every single day proving to you that you are the heart of Thornwood, the heart of my life." They returned to the manor that night, and the servants exchanged glances of wonder at the sight of the Duke, carrying the Duchess's wet cloak and refusing to leave her side. Something had shifted, something deep and irreversible. The healing did not happen overnight. It was a slow, tender, and deliberate process. Alexander began joining Livia on her tenant visits, listening intently as she explained the needs of each family. He made a public announcement at a tenant gathering, his voice strong and clear, praising his wife's generosity and taking no credit for himself. He commissioned a new school building in her honor with a brass plaque that read, "For the children of Thornwood, by the grace of their Duchess." He wrote a formal letter to Caroline's father, severing any lingering attachment, and making it clear that Lady Caroline was no longer welcome to visit uninvited. Caroline, furious, tried to spread venomous rumors, but the truth of Livia's goodness had already taken root, and society's whispers soon turned in Livia's favor. Evenings were spent in the small, warm parlor where Alexander would read aloud, poetry, history, whatever she wished, while Livia embroidered or simply rested her head against the back of the settee. He learned her favorite books, the precise way she took her tea, the stories of her quiet country childhood. He told her about his own lonely youth, the crushing weight of inheriting the dukedom too young, how Caroline had been a youthful infatuation that he had mistaken for love because it was easy and familiar. He confessed that he had been afraid of real emotion, of vulnerability, of needing someone and being found wanting. One evening, as the fire crackled and cast dancing shadows on the walls, he set down his book and took both her hands in his. "I want to marry you again," he said quietly, his gray eyes holding hers. "Not a contract, not a duty. A real ceremony with vows spoken from the heart. Will you have me, Livia? Will you let me start again?" Livia's eyes glistened. "I already have you, Alexander. But yes," she said, her smile breaking free like the sun after rain, "I would like that very much." And so, on a soft spring morning in the small stone chapel on the estate, with only the tenants and trusted staff as witnesses, they stood before the priest a second time. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colored light upon them. Alexander spoke vows he had written himself, his voice unsteady with emotion. "I, Alexander, take you, Livia, as my heart's true companion. I was lost in the cold, and you brought warmth. I was blind, and you gave me sight. I promise to see you, truly see you, every day for the rest of my life." Livia's voice was soft but sure as she answered, "I give you my heart, which has always been yours, and my trust, which you have earned anew." When they returned to the manor, the great hall was decorated with wildflowers the village children had gathered. There was laughter and music, and for the first time in generations, Thornwood Hall felt like a home. As spring deepened into summer, Livia walked through the gardens with her husband, her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm. The orchard was in full bloom, petals drifting like soft confetti. He leaned down and pressed a tender kiss to her temple. "You saved me," he murmured against her hair, "from my own cold heart." She looked up at him, her eyes full of a peace she had never thought she would feel. "We saved each other." They stood together, watching the sun set over the ridge where the tenant cottages now stood in good repair, smoke curling from chimneys in lazy, contented ribbons. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of understanding, of a love that had been tested and found true. The Duchess who had once been invisible was now the center of his world, and the Duke who had been a stranger was now her dearest friend. In the quiet hush of the evening, they simply breathed together, and it was enough. In the years that followed, the story of the silent Duchess and the Duke who learned to love was whispered through the county. It became a tale told to young girls to remind them that worth is not defined by the notice of others, and to young men that a heart can change. At Thornwood Hall, the portraits of Alexander and Livia were painted side by side, her hand resting gently in his, her smile genuine and bright. And if you visited the estate on a warm summer's day, you might see them walking still, heads bent close together. The distance between them vanished for good.